Okay, now before I begin into the actual analysis, I'll give you a quick crash course of Jeffrey Dahmer, where he came from, and, just a little bit of the events leading up to this here interview that occurred in 1993. So, Jeffrey Dahmer was a serial killer from America who took the lives of 17 men between the years of 1978 and 1991. His childhood was what would be considered happy and average until a personality shift occurred, centered around a surgery, more or less. Noticeably more subdued than before, he became increasingly withdrawn following the birth of his brother and his family's frequent moves. By the time he had reached his early teenage years, he was disengaged, tense, and had very few friends, if any. It was during that time that Dahmer reported first feeling his sinister cravings. Alcoholism controlled his young adult life as he dropped out of college and enlisted in the military. It was in the year of 1978 that he claimed his first victim. Over the next 13 years, Dahmer sought out men at bars, malls, and bus stops, lured them home, gave them laced alcoholic beverages before fatally strangling them. He would then engage in inappropriate and explicit acts with them before dismembering and disposing of them. However, he would often keep specific parts of them as souvenirs. Along with this, he would also take photos of his victims at various stages in his process so he could revel in his prior acts. One late night in 1991, one of Dahmer's victims escaped his captivity and flagged down a police car. He then led the cops back to Dahmer's apartment. They found photos of his victims as well as some of their parts in the refrigerator and freezer. Caught in the act, and with overwhelming physical evidence against him, Dahmer obviously confessed. In 1992, Dahmer entered a guilty but insane plea. However, a jury almost unanimously found him to be sane in each incident. He was then sentenced over 12 consecutive life sentences, but was killed in prison in 1994 by another inmate who was alleged to have used either a broom handle and or a stolen metal bar from the prison gym to beat Dahmer until he was nearly dead. Dahmer was pronounced dead on the way to the hospital due to multiple skull fractures and severe brain trauma. So that's your story. Let's go ahead and start into this actual analysis itself. Let's see what the nonverbal communication is of one of the most well-known serial killers in history.
I had these obsessive desires and thoughts wanting to control them, to, I don't know how to put it, possess them permanently.
Okay, so something that I will point out about Dahmer's nonverbal baseline is that he has a very subdued tone and very subdued nonverbal baseline as well. So that comes into play here and there as we can see him process through various things, but he regularly has halts in his phrasing as he tries to carefully plan out and think out his words. And he is not a very dynamic person non-verbally either. He doesn't have a lot of fidgeting or broad movements, so if we're looking for anything that strays from that to give us any red flags, this one's a pretty clean-cut, straightforward case, but there's still stuff to be able to learn from each incident where a person thinks or processes differently than the normal average population. There's hopefully something that we could still learn. So let's continue forward.
That's why you killed them.
Right. Not because I was angry with them, not because I hated them, but because I wanted to keep them with me. And as my obsession grew...
So that actually does seem to line up non-verbally. You can see his head movements are synchronized all the way throughout. There are no other anomalies that are happening besides the soothing gesture, placating gesture would almost be a way to put it, that he's doing with his hand off to the side. And that's a similar gesture to the, hey, now I'm explaining something, back off. I'm a little bit defensive about it, but this is the reason for that whole line of thinking. So that comes out there as well. So far, though, he seems very nonchalant in his actions, and I'll talk a little bit about what I was able to perceive from his psychological state, and then, we'll wrap up the video. Let's continue.
I was saving body parts such as skulls and skeletons. It's a process. It doesn't happen.
So building up to that, he was doing a little no shake in there, and that would be related to the, I don't know. I don't know. And that's where that no comes in there. I don't know. I did blah, blah, blah. So that comes in. And then after he mentions the parts that he was saving, he does lip compressions after each one. Those are interesting. Those are usually related to negative thoughts, or when a person's saying something that they know that they shouldn't, something along those lines, you'll see a lip compression crop up. There are many reasons for lip compression. These are the ones that make sense in context. So with that, he is cognizantly aware of the fact that what he does and had done was very wrong. And that's showing in his nonverbal communication. But what we're not seeing are any signs of shame or guilt during that as well. So let's continue playing.
Overnight, when you depersonalize another person and view them as just an object for pleasure instead of a living, breathing human being, it seems to make it easier to do things you shouldn't do.
Okay, so during this time, we can see that swallows in there. His mouth is getting a little bit dry while he's speaking about his actual murders. And this is interesting because that response indicates nerves, it indicates agitation. So there's some sort of psychological processing that he is doing around that isn't a positive one. It's prepping him for the fight or flight reaction. So there's something going on there. It's not guilt, but it is at least concern or maybe worry. Would it be about getting caught? Yeah, more likely than not, but it's not guilt. He's still not showing any indicators of shame in there. And then here where I have it paused now, he has a pretty substantial lip compression that's in there, and that's still related to what I explained earlier. So what I'm seeing from Dahmer is that he is aware of how wrong he was and how bad his actions were, but he didn't, it's almost like he just didn't care. Let's continue.
You do sound, though, like the kind of person who could have said to himself, "This is wrong. I must stop."
I always knew that it was wrong, but after the first killing was not planned.
So you can hear him having some of those psychophysiological things come in with the increased breathing. That's another sign of agitation or nerves. And he also has that extended, "I always knew it was wrong," which many of us would see that as bored. And that's still the brain needing oxygen in a different way. That sigh is called in from that side of things, but he's still disconnected from it emotionally. And this obviously pushes us to believe that he's either a psychopath or a sociopath, and I'm not a psychologist, so I'm not diagnosing him here, but that's why people believe that. That's why they see him as such, because of this emotional disconnect from what he's talking about. I'm here to really affirm that he's not feeling an emotional connection to it. It's not leaking out in any form or fashion at all. His channels are revealing other things, his emotional state in regards to anxiety or nerves or stress, but nothing in regards to empathy or guilt or shame. It's interesting. Let's continue.
I was coming back from the shopping mall back in '78. I had fantasies about picking up a hitchhiker and taking him back to the house and having complete control and dominance over him. No one had a clue as to what was happening for over a decade.
What happened to you in the 9 years in between that you were able to stop, that you were able to control yourself?
Just wasn't an opportunity to fully express what I wanted to do. There was just not the physical opportunity to do it then.
So something that I will note about Dahmer that is more chilling is that he doesn't feel like he's putting on a show for attention. In many cases, when you watch some of these interviews with serial killers or people who have done atrocious things, they have this complex, it seems, about them where they're asking for attention and they're really hamming up their side of things a lot, trying to make themselves sound creepier or crueler or more evil to garnish more of that attention. Jeffrey doesn't do anything like that in his. He's simply stating facts, it seems, from his side of things, where to us it's atrocious and horrifying what he's done and what he was saying that he would even continue to do. For him, it sounds like he's listing a grocery list, and emotionally speaking, that's all it's pegging in his mind as well, as something as arbitrary as that. It's very fascinating.
And I started, when I moved to Milwaukee in 81, I started reading pornography, going to the bookstores. Eventually that led to frequenting the gay bars. And then one time I brought this young man back to the hotel room, the Ambassador Hotel. Was just planning on drugging him and spending the night with him. I had no intention of hurting him. When I woke up in the morning, he had a broken rib here. I was heavily bruised. Apparently I had beaten him to death with my fists.
And you have no memory.
So something that I am noticing that is interesting about Dahmer is that when he's starting to say something that he did that was perhaps seen as more controversial or gruesome and brutal, he locks eye contact with who he's speaking to, almost to see what their response is. And this isn't uncommon for serial killers to want to receive that sort of attention from the people around them. They know that they have done terrible things, and they want to be able to see those reactions in people. Dahmer's thing was all about dominance and having control, and being able to see those emotional responses in the people that he's speaking to now is likely part of what encouraged him to be so forthcoming with what he had done. He knew he was caught. He had no hope to get out of any of his sentences now, but he did have this way of still adding shock value to the people that he spoke to, still lending him the emotional and psychological hand of dominance. I hope that makes sense. It's something that I have just noticed popping up around his whole recollection of things. Let's continue.
No memory of it. But that's what started the whole spree all over again.
When you killed these men, afterwards, were you repulsed? Were you upset?
No, at the time, it was almost addictive. It was almost a surge of energy. I wouldn't have to worry about any of their needs or anything. I just had complete control of the situation.
Why did you photograph them?
He's still being very authentic here. So far, from what I've seen, and it's difficult to say, especially if somebody is possibly sociopathic or psychopathic, to be able to see genuine, authentic body language is a little bit more difficult, as we've all kind of heard. So from what I can see, it seems like he's being very authentic here. Does he have the ability to lie and lie well? I have no doubt. Do I think he's doing so here? No, but let's continue.
It was my way of remembering their appearance, their physical beauty. I also wanted to keep something. If I couldn't keep them there with me whole, at least I felt that I could keep their skeletons. And I even went so far as planning on setting up an altar with the 10 different skulls and skeletons.
And what was the purpose of the altar going to be?
As a sort of memorial.
It's just so fascinating to me. So Dahmer's obviously a very dark human being. His psyche's very dark. But to watch him speak of what he's speaking of and how he's doing it, his nonverbal communication is fully authentic. He's being very authentic from what I can see here, even down to the smaller movements that are giving away like various emotional things. None of them are lending towards deception. It's not a desynchronized leakage. It's just him really amplifying what he's saying. In either one, he's consciously doing this, which is possible, or he's really genuinely being authentic here in what he's saying. And his disconnect between a person and their lives and who they are as a human being is incredible. He has fully disconnected in his mind what they are. They're now something else. They're not people. They're a material, an object. And he mentions that that's what he had to do or attempted to do to make things easier, which would lend us to believe that he was trying to say that it was difficult. I don't know on that one yet. Let's keep watching.
A point where I don't know. It's so bizarre and strange, it's hard to describe. A place where I could collect my thoughts and feed my obsession.
When the bodies were still in your apartment, there was no time when you would see them and say, "This is grotesque. What have I done?"
There were times, but the compulsive obsession with doing what
Watching the corner of his mouth during that time where he's saying there were times, it starts to creep upwards lightly. This is a sign of contempt, moral, or intellectual superiority. I don't believe that Dahmer has any level of moral superiority in this, but he could still see himself as having such, or just the intellectual superiority of it. Regardless, that really falls in line with Dahmer, this superiority, domination thing, if that makes sense.
I was doing overpowered any feelings of revulsion.
Before you went out to pick up the man, was there any kind of ritual you went through?
I'd go to the nightclubs, drink, watch the striptease shows, and if I didn't meet anyone at the bars, I'd go to the bath clubs and meet someone there, offer them money, and we'd go back to the apartment, have a few drinks. I'd have the sleeping pill mixture already prepared. Person would drink it, fall asleep, and that's when they would be strangled. I felt so hopelessly evil and perverted that I actually derived a sort of pleasure from watching that tape.
Did you like feeling evil?
So what I'm watching for in this area as he's talking about these things is to see if there are any micro or mini expressions of disgust slipping into his baseline, to see perhaps maybe he does feel some disgust at least towards the actions that he's done. So he's saying verbally that he felt so evil and perverted that he enjoyed watching, and I think it was The Exorcist 3 was the tape that he's referring to here. But I'm not seeing that reflected elsewhere. For a little bit, he does a pretty substantial and large lip compression and furrows his eyebrows and closes his eyes all in one deal, and that would be considered a grimace. That's the closest that I could see towards disgust towards his actions. But for the most part, he doesn't seem to have any negative repercussions in his psychology about his actions. It's still just it's different.
No, I didn't. But I had tried to overcome the thoughts, and it worked for a while, but eventually I gave in.
Do you still feel those same urges? Do you still feel that compulsion, that obsession?
I wish I could say that it just left completely, but no, there are times when I still do have the old compulsions. I started having these obsessive thoughts when I was
I'm not so certain that he wishes they were gone or that they're the old compulsions. It seems as though he really does still feel them, and I don't know that they're considered. I don't know what his scale is of old compulsions, is what I'm saying, is that if he's still feeling them, then they're not the old compulsions. They're just not able to be enacted on. So I just found that word choice that he had there interesting, but I don't think that they're in any way behind him. I think, well, now obviously, but at this point I don't think they were anywhere near behind him. So let's continue.
I was about 15 and 16, and they got worse and worse.
What were your fantasies about?
They were sexual fantasies of control, power, complete dominance. They became reality.
Was there pleasure in that fantasy?
There was excitement, fear, pleasure, all mixed together. I was branching out, that's when the cannibalism started, eating of the heart and the arm muscle. It was a way of making me feel that they were a part of me. At first, it was just curiosity, and then it became compulsive. Then I tried to keep the person alive by inducing a zombie-like state. By injecting first dilute acid solution into their brain or hot water, and it never did completely work.
Could someone like you be stopped? Could you be helped?
No, I was dead set on going with this compulsion. It was the only thing that gave me any satisfaction. I kept the...
It's interesting. Something else that Dahmer does is he never tries to shift his blame to anyone else. He's not a victim in his storyline. He takes almost pride in him doing what he wanted. And that's a fascinating aspect of it, which sometimes you can see somebody, a serial killer or a murderer, or even just a criminal of any level, having a reason for where they are now, if that makes sense. But he doesn't do that. It's another very fascinating facet of Dahmer's mind, how he thought and how he perceived the world. And for him to take borderline pride in what he was doing is just adding another level of, I don't know, sinister value to him. It's a lot, right?
The mummified head and skull of one of the victims in a carrying case in my locker at work.
Were you almost flaunting it?
Yes, but that's how strong the compulsion was. That's how bizarre the desire was. I wanted to keep something of the person with me.
Was there any kind of incident that you can remember?
So he keeps using the words compulsion, and anytime that he describes his acts, except for a few choice areas, he uses words like bizarre or strange instead of dark or twisted, something along those lines. And I don't know if this is him trying to validate it in his own mind, the things that he did, and make it to where it's not as severe. But it's just, he's complex. He's arguably very, very complex. Yeah, we could talk a little bit more later.
To this day, I don't know what started it. And the person to blame is sitting right across from you. That's the only person. Not parents, not society, not pornography. I mean, those are just excuses.
What was the turning point for you that made you suddenly realize that you had done something terribly wrong, something you should be sorry for?
It was the night of the arrest. I have no memory of what happened during the 6 hours before the last victim ran out of the apartment. I heard a knock on the door, and the police were there with the last victim. They asked me where the key was to the handcuffs. My mind was in a haze. I sort of pointed to the bedroom, and that's where they found the pictures. And they yelled, "Cuff him." I was handcuffed, and it was just the realization that there was no point in trying to hide my actions anymore. The best route was to...
Micro head movements, during that entire recollection period there indicate authenticity just because they are synchronized with the words that he's saying. He's still telling the truth.
To help the police identify all the victims and just make a complete confession.
10 of your 17 victims were black. Were they racially motivated?
It was not racially motivated. It was not sexual preference. It was just to find an obsession with the best-looking young man I could find. Never understood it. There was no use trying to fight it because I couldn't rid myself of it.
So when he's responding to the racial question there, he says it was not, and that's the first time that he uses that sort of prolonged and emphasized wording. It was not, instead it wasn't. He has been using contractions pretty regularly throughout the rest of this with his verbal patterns. So to have it was not, that means that he's really trying to emphasize that. So looking at that, I would have liked to be able to see what he was doing during that time while he was saying that, to see if there's a desynchronization, because all that I can say from his words is that he really wanted to emphasize that. I'd have to ask, why did he really want to emphasize that over anything else? I'm not sure. I'm really not sure why. Besides, maybe that's his line. That's his line, is that this wasn't a racial thing. He's a horrible human being, but he's not a racist. Okay, interesting. Let's keep watching.
It was too powerful and persistent.
Do you dislike it?
Yes, it's caused a lot of problems for me. A lot of conflicts and unanswered questions.
If you were out on the street now, would you still be committing the crimes?
Probably. If this hadn't happened, there's no doubt I probably would be. I can't think of anything that would have stopped me.
Okay, so that's the interview done in 1993. Within the next 365 days, he was murdered in prison. So that is Jeffrey Dahmer. Looking back through this and also considering the other footage that I went through to be able to help study and prepare for this, I do believe that he had a severe psychological disconnect between what his actions were and the emotions that they ought to invoke. He felt no displayable shame during all of that. There was nothing to indicate that level of emotion. He did have plenty of false starts. He had a dry mouth. He had plenty of breathing shifts to where his breathing would become more fluttery or less fluttery. He had a lot of swallows in there and lip compressions, and the list goes on, all related to nerves and agitation, a negative emotion to be sure, but not guilt. I don't believe that Dahmer ever felt genuinely guilty for what he did, at least to what you and I would probably feel. This was interesting to me. I think that I could probably spend most of the rest of my career studying people like Dahmer and finding out more and more and more about how nonverbal communication portrays over severe cases like this, where the brain is obviously processing a little bit different. Okay, for those of you who have not seen the video that I have done on Jeffrey Dahmer and would like to have a little bit more context as to what is going on in this specific case, in case you just haven't heard of perhaps one of the most notorious serial killers in history. So if you want to be able to know more about that, go ahead and follow the link in the description of this video. That will give you some background to this. In this, we're going to be watching Lionel as he talks about his experience of being a father to Jeffrey and how that will all play out, and seeing if there are any indications or hints as to what could have led Jeffrey down the path that he is on. Let's go ahead and dive into the video itself.
This is the father of the young man who committed those crimes. He's the father of Jeffrey Dahmer, Lionel Dahmer. Today, we're talking with parents who all somehow, some way, raised violent sex offenders, child molesters, rapists. And we're asking, what goes wrong from the time a child is born to the time they are savagely somebody else's child? That's what we're here to try and figure out today, so that other parents can stop this from happening to your own children, so that you might notice the signs and be able to do something before it's too late. Did you notice the signs, Mr. Dahmer?
No, the only signs that I saw were shyness and reluctance to engage in social interactions, that sort of thing, but no, really no overt signs of any kind.
Okay, I wanted to go ahead and include that rather intense introduction, because that is what Lionel was stepping onto the show for. This is the pretense that he was setting and everything along those lines. Now, with his nonverbal communication, just from what we're seeing so far, it is very neutral. He does have possibly a slight contempt smile in there, but it's such a small one, and it's not lining up with any specific emotional display or reactive circumstance that would allow it to be more of a tell, but this might be just more how he rests. This might be his baseline. So now we're going through and we can kind of hear how his tone is. And so right now in this part, especially where there's less confrontation or anything along those lines, I'm watching to see just how he behaves during this interview to be able to make our accuracy just a little bit higher. So let's continue watching this.
One of the things you wrote in the book called A Father's Story, when you're trying to account for how this happened to your son and to your family, one of the things that you say, though, is that this same sense of something dark and shadowy, of a malicious force growing in my son, now colors almost every memory I have of his childhood. In a sense, his childhood no longer exists. So that when you look back on little things, things that you thought were little things at the time, somehow seem to foreshadow this monster that was created over the years.
Yeah, it's a sort of a retrospect sort of thinking now. When I look back on things like the time I was at Iowa State University in university housing, and I went underneath the house to clear it out of trash and debris.
And he was 4 years old at the time.
He was about 4 years old, yeah. And
because you smell something under the house.
yeah, civet cats. It's a member of the skunk family, and I wanted to go underneath and fix it up so they wouldn't get in again. And I found cans and bottles and bones of mammals that the civet cats, the skunks, had eaten. And so I cleared all of this debris up, including the bones, and put it into a metal pail. Jeff was there and my former wife was there, and it was just an ordinary operation at the time, just a cleanup operation.
So you gone under the house and you found that these little skunk-like creatures had eaten a lot of the rodents.
Yeah. And left bones.
And left the bones.
So I'm going to go ahead and pause this. Obviously, this doesn't have much to do with Dahmer as of yet, Jeffrey Dahmer as of yet. But I will note that as Lionel is speaking, I'm referring to them as their first names here. I'm going to continue to do that from this point on because that will be the easiest to distinguish between the two Dahmers that I'm talking about. So Lionel, Mr. Dahmer, I suppose. Lionel, he presents a very fluid nonverbal communication and affirmation as he's recollecting this story, talking about going underneath the house. And you could see him looking about as he's recollecting different aspects of it, different sensory memories of the experience itself. But along with that, he's also nodding in affirmation as he's saying, like, this is the thing that he did. We did this, we did this, we did this, we did this, we did this. And it's this positive affirmation nod that creeps in there that just lets us know that he's being very synchronized with this. So on this level here, we could be like, oh, well, this would be an instance of an authentic story that he's telling. So we're seeing kind of what that would flow like non-verbally, and this will be useful to be able to use against other segments throughout the interviews or in other interviews and footage around. But let's continue watching.
And left the bones. So you pull the bones out from under the house, and your wife at the time and Jeffrey Dahmer, 4 years old, they're standing out, and he started to go through the pail of bones. He was just 4 years old.
Right.
Correct?
We were just discussing, my former wife and I, what I was doing, and I looked down and I saw Jeff
playing with the bones,
picking up the bones and dropping them back into the pail. And that was really the only time that I saw
Did he seem fascinated?
He didn't really seem overly fascinated, just sort of amused that they sort of dropped down and clanked and, you know, made a clanking noise.
He called them fiddlesticks.
And he said it's sort of like fiddlesticks, you know, these old pickup sticks.
So some things that I want to note that have already kind of fallen into Lionel's nonverbal patterns here is he's having difficulty vocally. He's stuttering and stammering a lot. So this question, this area obviously already is agitating him on some level. Otherwise, that wouldn't be reflecting so clearly. Along with that, when he was saying that this was really the only thing that we saw, he has some agitation coming there. There's some pitch increase in there. There's a little bit of tone strain. Also, his eyebrows raise. He leans back a little bit. And that is also a nonverbal spike. So in that area, if that's causing him that much agitation, and then with the leaning back and also along with that, a little tiny micro head shake. No, we have to ask, okay, so what caused you to do that burst there? What thought process was that? Right now, it's a red flag. It does have some tendencies to maybe have distancing or desynchronization gestures, but we're not quite positive as of yet. However, what we do also want to note is that Lionel is setting this up to where, of course, he had little to no effect on how Dahmer, how his son, Jeffrey Dahmer, turned out. And as we know on the channel here, a lot of the times when there's an instance like this and somebody begs that they're completely 100% positively pure in this that it oftentimes is not true. But let's check to see how this is. Let's continue forward.
Pickup sticks that you used to play as a kid, and that was his name for fiddle for pickup sticks. And he just seemed amused, and I wouldn't say overly fascinated or taken with it, but yeah. But in retrospect, looking back now, like you say, everything is sort of colored with memories like that.
Other memories?
The time that he had a double hernia operation, when he, wondered whether he had his penis cut off, when he actually just had a double hernia operation.
How old was he then?
Concerned about that. About the same age range, about 40.
He was sick a lot, was he not?
He was very sick with ear and nose infections.
Okay, so these are some things that I also want to make note of that aren't really pulled in other areas. Is this continually sick, and also there's this aspect of he had this very severe, painful surgery, operation, everything go on when he was very, very young, and that's a very developmental time in a child's life. So that's important to note. But as we're continuing forward here, something that you will also notice as we're going forward is that Lionel's attachment to Dahmer, to Jeffrey, is not one of emotional intimacy on any level. And that wasn't unheard of in the day for fathers to not have connections with their sons that way. So that does exist. And there are some other aspects as well that are coming into play. But in that, Dahmer alone was a sick child and was sick regularly. That in and of itself can cause difficulties in a family. And so we're seeing already a lot of possibilities for a not so great childhood, despite Dahmer himself or Jeffrey Dahmer himself and Lionel both insisting that the childhood was pretty okay. It's kind of contradictory, and their side doesn't make as much sense as to what has kind of come to play. But let's keep watching.
Infections, and he would get injections at the local hospital.
So when you look back to times where I think in the same age range, because we now know your personality is formed by the time you're 6 years old. So whatever's there is there.
Generally, yes.
Show me a boy at 6, we'll show you a man at 36. Some people have said. So when the time he was walking through the house and asked you or your wife, what would happen if my navel was cut out?
I had a habit of recording him as a child.
Mm-hmm.
Just, the old type, reel tape,
mm-hmm.
just miles and miles of it. And I had that transcribed about a year and a half ago to regular cassette tape. And I came across this one portion where he asked me, Dad, what would happen? We were just engaged in conversation about his body. And he said, what would happen if we cut out my navel? And I can remember just passing it off at the time, and it was maybe just an innocent question.
That's one of those things
but
kids
now, looking back, yeah, it's just one of those things that kids say out of interest.
You say in your book.
Okay, so this is something else that I do want to make note about Jeffrey Dahmer's father and how he kind of viewed Jeffrey, it seemed. With this, even I did a lot of recording of him. The way that Lionel will refer to Jeffrey is almost as if Jeffrey is a specimen of some sorts. And sure enough, Lionel is a scientist, so that could be just perhaps how his verbiage goes. But even down to the fact that in very overt ways, Lionel said that he wanted people to do tests on Jeffrey to be able to figure out what it was that happened. Lionel's view of Jeffrey was not that of compassion, it seemed to be so much more focused on that of curiosity with this scientific drive towards, which, that also being said, growing up as a child and having that be the vibe, so to speak, that you get from your parental figure, that does not do so great for developing good, strong, healthy connections with them, and also allowing you to be able to then build stronger and healthier connections throughout the rest of your social life. So with this already coming into play here, we're seeing a very young Jeffrey Dahmer who's portraying possibly some interesting sort of characteristics here in arguably largely turbulent household and separated from his father, the dominating figure in the family. This all does make more sense for who and how Jeffrey behaved, but let's continue.
Lionel, you say, I've come to believe that some of the compulsions that overwhelm my son may have had their origins in me. That must be a frightening realization.
It was one of the items that I wanted to investigate. Being a scientist, I want to throw out everything for
You're a scientist and a
investigation.
chemist.
Yes, right. And there are a number of things. Did he turn out? Most people want to know why this happened.
Yeah.
Number one.
Immediately, we all thought when we heard these heinous, horrible stories, we thought, who abused him? Did you abuse him? Was he abused? Was he sexually molested? Was he beaten as a child?
Those were the first thoughts that came to your mind.
Yeah.
Probably. I considered all kinds of things. Was it environmental, genetic? Was it perhaps medic?
That small section bothered me a fair bit with how Lionel responded to that line of questioning from Oprah, because Oprah brings up the question of how does this happen? Yeah, obviously. And his response is this very soft, withdrawn, the only way that I could possibly describe the tone would be aloof tone that he takes in, where he's like, that's probably what you thought, wasn't it? Like this odd tone in there. And it's a very calculated, anticipatory tone to where it feels like he's talking down to, or as if he's anticipated this on some level or expecting this on some level. It is conveying a level of intellectual or moral superiority, even in just the tone and display of that. So that is fascinating to me. And he's going through and he's talking about all these different options that he has listed or that he was considering because he's a scientist and this and that and this and that. And what's interesting is that he doesn't answer the question right away. He does throw in these other details, and he's also doing little tiny micro shakes now in there. Now, could that be just synchronization with the thing? You wouldn't believe what I've dug up. I don't know. Possibly, but they are really, really small. And we've also had this other interesting tonal spike before that. So this is just an interesting, curious spot here. I'm not super certain on that. It's just a red flag. I would want to definitely try to pick and probe a little bit more at this was he assaulted side of things before just skirting right on by. But let's just keep watching the video.
Perhaps medications that were taken at the time of, in the first trimester. Was it the effect of, the popular subject now, media violence?
Mm-hmm.
And was it genetic? These are all things to consider.
Was he molested?
No, he wasn't molested.
Was he physically abused in the home?
No, he was not physically abused. No.
So
these two responses also stray from how he was speaking just before. He not only verbatim responds the question with an answer of the exact same line, no, he was not, no, he was not. That exact verbiage still exists in there. Now, with that alone, he has a substantial drop-off in tone and pitch and just overall strength behind his voice. So it's very soft and very low. He also has a little bit of a lip compression and possible disgust micro-expression slip in there as well when he answers the first question. And now from this side, it's a little bit more difficult to see. But he answers, and he has a no shake in there as well. So with the no shake, that is synchronized with what he is saying no. That does make sense. So that would be pushing towards authenticity. There are the possibilities of the pitch changes in there and the force within the voice as well. And then also that micro expression of the lip compression and disgust coming in, all centered around that negative emotion. Perhaps there's still something there. At this point, there are still enough red flags for me to want to still curve back around and approach again. But with the synchronization of the no, maybe. But it is still something that I find interesting. So let's continue watching.
No.
So when you analyze and you have a very analytical mind, that's what you do for a living.
Yes.
You go back.
That's my training.
Yes. And when you go back and the reason you say you've written a story is to.
That I find interesting too. Yes, that's my training. So it feels as if he at this point is also trying to excuse how he is behaving in regards possibly to Jeffrey. But I do find that fascinating that he does throw in, yes, that's my training, to add more qualifier to that, as if we needed more qualifying to that. But I don't know, seemed defensive. Just make a note of it. Let's continue.
You've written a story is to try to make some sense of it.
Right.
As you analyze and go back over the years, trying to figure out how this could have happened, what have you concluded?
I've concluded that there are many more questions. I've answered some of the questions in my own mind, but very few. There's more questions that have been raised than have been answered. Well, I really do feel, I don't have really a lot of scientific evidence for this.
Okay, so some things that I am now seeing come up here. You can see him do a little postural change mixed in with some shrugs there. Well, I really do feel, and he's having difficulty with the stammering and stuttering that's kind of coming in there as well. But what you can also hear on top of that is you can hear the clicking inside his mouth, where his mouth has now become quite dry. So now he's showing a spike of interesting nonverbal communication about what he's concluded here. And even with his initial answer, his answer was that, oh, I concluded that I have a lot of questions. And so it's still this matter of dodging around the subject that some people found to be curious and fascinating. I also would agree on that, but let's continue watching just to see how this plays out.
But I feel, and this is a message that I wanted to convey to parents, that I feel that if a youngster, especially a male youngster, comes through his puberty and keeps everything in, bottles everything up inside himself, without talking to peers or family or friends, anyone at all, about their fears and angers and frustrations. I feel very strongly that it's possible that their all of those fears
Or signs of
anger
trouble.
can get mixed up with the sexual awakening, such that they don't even understand
What's going
on.
What's interesting, though, about Jeffrey Dahmer, your son, is that not these signs, according to what you've written here, didn't show up after, or during puberty. As you record, his first grade teacher noticed or had said to you when you went to the school to talk to her that he was a distant child, he didn't associate with the other children, that she had seen him on the playground pacing back and forth.
Just doing nothing.
Doing absolutely nothing. He was not communicative. He didn't wish to associate with the other children, performed his tasks, but did them with absolutely no interest.
Right.
I'm sure that there are a lot of parents who are listening who say, well, that could be my child. So does that mean your child can turn out to be Jeffrey Dahmer?
There's millions of people who are shy. I was definitely shy.
And so you felt that some of the signs that he had, you had experienced that too.
I was pathetic, right. I gave variance to that to some degree, I felt that I understood that.
Yeah, because he was just a shy kid.
Right.
But he was more than shy. He was fear-stricken.
There was something developing in his mind that So
during that time while Lionel's talking, something that I just want to make note of so you can kind of see how this does play across as well. This is an area where he's feeling a little insecure or defensive, talking about his own shyness. And with that's where we see these hunching shoulders coming up, a little bit of turning of the head, and you can hear his tone fall off and his pitch go up a little bit. So, I mean, I was shy. And so it's that defensive insecurity that creeps in there that we could see that. It's understandable in that specific section. I don't think that if a child hangs out by themselves a lot, that means that they're going to end up like Dahmer. No, that would be a leap. So I can understand why he would be defensive. I mean, I was shy too. That makes sense. So in that context, that just even allows us to see this is how Lionel behaves when he's feeling defensive. If that pops up elsewhere where it doesn't make as much sense, well, then we have some reference for that. We can circle back around, maybe ask more questions, clarify. But for now, let's keep watching.
It's so bizarre that we just cannot imagine. Now, the difference there, I think, is that he did not have any reality contact checks, with people. I think that it's really incumbent upon parents to check to see if their kids are talking to anyone about their fears.
You opened this book saying, if the police had told me that my son was dead, I would have thought differently about him. If they told me that a strange man had lured him to a seedy apartment and a few minutes later drugged, strangled, and mutilated his dead body. If they told me the same horrible things that they had to tell so many other fathers and mothers in July of 1991, then I would have done what they have done. I would have mourned my son and demanded that the man who killed him be profoundly punished. But I wasn't told what these other mothers and fathers were told, that their sons were dead at the hands of a murderer. Instead, I was told that my son was the one who had murdered their sons. I want, when we come back, to go back to the day when you had to be told that your son had done these horrible things.
I want to go ahead and pause that. So that's something that I do want to make note of that I did find at least somewhat admirable of Lionel's perspective is his ability to understand, or at least cognitively say that he understands various aspects of other people's perspectives. That self-awareness is appreciated, but that is just one aspect of it. Even with the writing of the book, a lot of people called him out for perhaps trying to take advantage of what was going on during that time. But now we're back here again. Let's continue watching.
Thanks. I'm talking with Lionel Dahmer. Lionel Dahmer is the father of Jeffrey Dahmer, who has taken his own dark journey into trying to understand why his son became the monster that he did. And he writes of this in his book. It's called A Father's Story. A lot of people would say, Mr. Dahmer, you're just trying to capitalize on the crimes of your son.
Well, money is not my prime mover at all. My main...
Very fun right on that. So, well, sits back, clears throat, postural change, a lot of blinking in there. This confrontation has obviously hit, and his response to it is money is not my main mover, which is just a clever way of saying, yeah, you might be right, but that might not be the only reason why. And then with all that spike before that, then I'm not even necessarily sure that I buy that portion. But even he himself admits that, like, yeah, money drove this a lot too. So let's continue.
Mover is to find out what went wrong and to help people. And
could you have done that without writing a book, though, do you think?
I don't know. I've had so much interaction with people as a result of writing the book, so much feedback that I don't think I would have had if I would have just gone out on my own and tried to, and I might not have investigated so fervently and
yourself
in depth.
Yes.
Myself.
Let me ask you, do you think that there are other Jeffrey Dahmers being bred out there?
Yes, I do.
So that is a fair point from him. Perhaps if he hadn't written the book, then maybe not as much traction for it. But I don't know that it was his book that really set the precedent for understanding what happened with Jeffrey Dahmer. So it still did kind of just come out to be a capitalizing sort of situation. But that is fair. More traction that way, more publicity, perhaps, than if it was a scientific journal, something along those lines. Let's continue.
Yes, I do. I think that there's always a great... Our family was pretty much ordinary. I mean, I participated with Jeff in all kinds of activities. There's nothing really greatly out of the ordinary, yet something was...
Okay, this is interesting. Our family was very ordinary. There's nothing out of the ordinary, really hammering home this idea that everything was ordinary. I did everything with Jeff, and he breaks eye contact, and he's looking away, has some vocal stuttering and stammering in there. This almost feels like he's really trying to hammer home, rather unconvincingly, that the home life was ordinary. And even just knowing some of the facets that we've already heard, there are some complexities that are in there, but that, I guess an argument could be made that every single household has some complexities, so maybe that's ordinary, quote unquote. But in this area, it does feel like he's really trying to convince, please don't examine the family because we were so ordinary. Don't look into that whatsoever. And that is still fascinating. Let's see how that plays out.
Was connecting in his sexuality and his developing youth that you and I just can't even relate to. And I think that there are many more out there. We have gotten letters, as a matter of fact, from people who say they have these same urges.
You say ordinary, but you were an emotionally distant father, would you say?
Well,
like so many fathers, you raised, you say, even in the book, you say.
By distant, I mean that...
For you, loving was going to work every day, providing for the family,
right.
You know.
I wrestled around and, goofed around with my son a lot. But to say that maybe, I don't know if I was emotionally equipped to handle
whatever was going on with him.
Yeah.
But you went fishing with him.
Okay, so this is one of those indicators. So in the book, he says that he was not emotionally very present, as many fathers of the time were. But along with that, though, you could see him now starting to have some insecurity come in with some heavy chin tucking behaviors as he's trying to be like, well, maybe I wasn't like there, as he's starting to feel very defensive because of his inability to emotionally support his children. So with that coming in there and creeping in there, and he's feeling defensive about it, he's trying to say that, well, I did like play and stuff like that. And I mean, that's fair, but what causes the sort of things that Jeffrey Dahmer was working with is not like playing or roughhousing enough. It's around the emotional side of things. And so to have that knowledge as well, to know that that emotional distance was there, and the other facets of feeling kind of like a specimen, of being observed and recorded for various things, and these various facets, it does kind of help me understand the relationship that did exist between Jeffrey and Lionel, regardless of kind of what's been presented. But let's keep watching to see how that actually does play out here.
Fishing with him, went fishing and did all the fatherly things.
We did tennis for years. We went tobogganing, sledding, participated in 4-H. We raised lambs together, chickens in 4-H for 3 years.
Wasn't he fascinated then, though, with the innards of animals?
You know, he never really demonstrated that to me, nor to anyone around.
I thought when you went fishing and you'd cut open the fish, he'd be all...
He did not demonstrate at that time. Actually, Oprah, all of this information came out at the trial.
Uh-huh.
And at the time we were fishing, he never exhibited any type of
unusual
amazement, or his eyes didn't
when you're gutting the
widen or
fish.
say anything. Right. Uh-huh. But at the trial, one of the expert witnesses, Dr. Becker, brought this out with him. And apparently he was...
So here we're hearing Lionel talking about how he was not able to pick up on any of the nonverbal tells of what Jeffrey was experiencing at the time, with like widening of the eyes or whatnot. And that's just another indicator of like, yeah, well, that's because that's not what it looks like. That's not how it would represent. You need to dig a little bit more into that. But with that, I still just find it interesting that he's still saying, oh, even in the areas where I said that he did interesting stuff throughout my childhood, I had no there was no suspicion, no idea, no anything with that. And maybe that's true. Perhaps Jeffrey hid everything perfectly. And the attentive father that Lionel said he was, the good father who maybe wasn't emotionally present, but definitely knew how to roughhouse pretty well with his kid, just didn't see it because of how amazingly well Jeffrey hid it. That could be the case. I don't necessarily buy that it was just Jeffrey's master manipulation that prevented Lionel from seeing anything. Perhaps Lionel did see and didn't want to admit, or he doesn't care enough to see, or had the inability to see because he had not been practicing how to be emotionally present for the people around him. So regardless of what's going on here, Lionel is still having a level of responsibility in this circumstance that he is still just trying to slough off completely. He's just an innocent guy that has been walking along this entire time, and all of this was more or less just kind of centered around Jeffrey and how Jeffrey did his own thing, and that's got to be it. And I'm not certain that that would be the actual circumstances there. There's usually more nuance than that, but let's keep watching.
Apparently, he was, caught up with the color of the fish. But so in retrospect, maybe it was just an ordinary thing, but now going back to what we said before, everything is sort of foreshadowed. You think back on...
When you were at his home, there was a time when you were at his home after he had moved to Milwaukee. I know we're skipping on here.
Home.
At your mother's home. And you had gone to look in a box, and he had said, don't open the box because there was, pornography in there?
I had found some pornographic material prior to that, and I thought there was pornographic material in it.
By this time, you know your son's a little off, though, right?
Well, I don't know. What do you mean by off? I mean, I felt
exhibiting unusual behavior.
Interested in pornography,
Mm-hmm.
I guess, and there's probably a lot of young men that are
Mm-hmm.
interested. It didn't occur to me that was greatly different. In other words, I've always thought of him as being very, very shy, having feelings of inferiority, and yes, looking at pornography, perhaps.
So when you opened the box,
it didn't occur to me to be anything greatly strange.
You didn't see that there was anything to be greatly concerned about.
Well, my mother had found the box.
Mm-hmm.
It was unopened. It was locked.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked Jeff to open it. I came to her house, asked him to open it.
Thinking it was going to be pornography.
Yeah, right.
And he opened it, and what was there?
He resisted opening it.
Yeah.
Okay. I insisted. He got mad. He tore up the birthday check that I gave him that same day. It was his birthday.
How old was he?
And he said he was in his 20s, middle to late 20s. And he said, "Can't I have just 1 square foot?" That's about how big the box was, of privacy. Let's just wait till tomorrow morning. He said, "I'll open it then." Because my mother was there, and he said, "Let's not create a scene. Let's wait till tomorrow. I'll open it then. I'll show you what's in it."
Okay, so at this point, even from Lionel's perspective, to see that sort of behavior from Jeffrey. Now, obviously, Jeffrey had more of a subdued personality. Even if you go and watch his interviews and whatnot, his personality was not very verbose. He was not very emotive or grandeur with his gesturing. He's a very subdued guy. So for him to suddenly have this outburst like that, just out of the blue, it seems, either one, this is extremely illogical and be a huge red flag, so that would be an indicator of agitation. There's something going on with that box that might be more than what was said, or it could indicate that there are more difficulties in that relationship than what have been earlier stated. It seems as though perhaps there might have been an element of overt control in Jeffrey's life where he didn't have the ability to have control over aspects of his own life. And then with this also being with the separation between father and son, everything else that has come before this in the video, all in context, that makes more sense in that confrontation, that perhaps there was more to that lash out that Jeffrey had than what we're just finding here in this recollection. It could be an indicator of how that family dynamic, how father-son dynamic went there, but let's keep watching to see.
It's what you think. I still went downstairs after a tool to open it, and he grabbed the box. He said, "Wait, please." And I acceded. I just, I felt the feelings of empathy that he was so shy and he just felt like he couldn't even have any.
When you finally opened the box.
I didn't open the box. No. He brought.
Okay, so then in that point, it seems as though a kind decision was made by Lionel in respecting a little bit of Jeffrey's privacy and granting that to him. So now I have to wonder what led, what was the dynamic of those boundaries and crossing thereof between the parent and kids before? How did that play out as to what led to this specific instance that Lionel backed off so suddenly? I just find it interesting. There's obviously some dynamic there that we're missing for context, but we'll continue watching.
He brought it down the next morning, and there indeed were pornographic materials in there, which satisfied me.
Because that's what you thought was there.
Yeah, and frankly, Oprah, I don't know what I would have done if I would have opened the box, forcibly opened that box, and seen what was in there.
Because what was in there?
A human head.
When we come back, I'll ask Lionel what his son Jeffrey Dahmer said to him during their first conversation following his arrest. We're talking to Lionel Dahmer. We'll be talking to...
No, I've also watched where Jeffrey was talking about that instance as well, and that does line up story-wise, even with how Lionel was telling it to across how Jeffrey was telling it. Both of those sides line up quite nicely. So that indicates that throughout that was an authentic recollection of that instance there. And it's very interesting to hear it from both sides and both perspectives as to how each person was thinking or processing on that one. So that is something that if you're ever interested, try to hop around on the internet and find that interview as well. And might even be able to be on here. And even with this recollection that he's speaking on, we're not seeing a lot of emotional display on his face. So we do know that as far as how Lionel does express his emotions, it's very muted. That leans into everything else that we've understood, but let's continue.
Talking to Lionel Dahmer, we'll be talking to other parents today who raised sons who ended up committing horrible crimes against society and other people's children. Do you see your son often?
On the average, once a month.
Once a month.
Sometimes a little bit more often, depending upon the need. There's been a lot of legal problems that have come up. And
what does he say to you? What did he say to you after the arrest?
Right after the arrest, the first time I saw him, he hung his head and looked very disheveled, and he said, "I'm so sorry, Dad. don't know what to say. There's nothing I can say. I did it again. So, in other words, it was just another, I'm sorry. It really wasn't that much more intense than the other times when, he committed less things like lesser crimes, like drunkenness and so forth.
He was drunk from the time he was 16 years old, going to school drunk?
It was somewhere in the 16, 17, 18 year range, which was...
So this is also another thing that I want to point out is Jeffrey just hung his head, said, I'm sorry, I don't know what to say, and I did it again. So this sounds like something to where Jeffrey is at least used to apologizing and saying, I'm sorry, for various instances, and even Lionel backs that with being like, this was no different than all of the other many times that he said, I'm sorry. And I'm wondering how much of Jeffrey's life was lived where he felt like he had to apologize for things that he felt or perceived or things along those lines. And that could be yet another facet that built into what he turned himself into as he grew up. But let's continue watching this.
Which was completely hidden from me.
Mm-hmm. He was going to school. He was an alcoholic by the time he was 16.
It appeared to be so.
Going to school drunk every day, trying to cope with all of his fears of not being able to socialize and so forth.
Never came home drunk, never came home in a state that gave him away. Picked up liquor on the way at a friend's house. And this happened at school, drinking at school, apparently.
But by that time, he was already roaming the neighborhood streets on his bike and collecting animal remains. And
age 13, 14. It's just inconceivable. And it's also...
How was a child able to dismember animals and, take the skin off their bones? And you were a chemist, and he had been around you and, working with you at times. But how was he able to do that without you or your wife or your mother, anybody knowing that's what was going on?
Well, we had about 1 3/4 acres of heavily wooded property, and the adjacent properties were easy to hide. And Jeff was very good at hiding.
This is your home there?
Yes. And there were so many areas that he could have done it in. And he timed it, apparently, when my former wife and I weren't around.
And that's where he killed his first victim there?
Yes.
Yeah. That you knew nothing about?
I knew nothing about it at all. It's amazing. If only a neighbor... I knew after the fact, at the trial, I knew at that point that some of the neighbor kids knew that he was cruising around the neighborhood on a bike looking for, dead animals. That's all that they knew, apparently. But if I had known that would have been such a big red flag. I would have had him to a psychiatrist in a minute.
Do you think so?
I would have.
In retrospect, that would have been the flag. But all the other things weren't flags.
No, not really. They were always explainable. They were always within the realm of my experience, shyness, inferiority feelings. Nothing really exceptionally stood out.
So now what does your son say to you?
I want to go ahead and pause here as we're just thinking back through this still. Lionel is painting this picture of how Jeffrey was able to effectively more or less hide this from his parents fully, from everybody around him fully, from a very young age and very efficiently, which, if this is the case, then there's a number of things that are playing in there. Obviously, Jeffrey would have to be a very intelligent child to be able to do all of these different things so effectively to fool every single adult in his life, including his science father, who has a very analytical and observant mind. As he himself has said, he has been trained to do. But with that, they're not able to catch on to any of their son's behaviors that are interesting. I'm finding it interesting that there were some things that could have definitely been picked up on, but there wasn't enough attention being given to pick up on them. And then along with that, if, say, Lionel is telling the truth here and that Jeffrey did this so brilliantly to himself, kept it very secret. The other question is, well, why would you be urged to do that? Why would you be so urged to keep everything so secret? And how would you be able to do it so well by such an early age? To me, the most logical explanation for that would be that he probably had been doing it for a minute. Jeffrey had been used to hiding things from his parents, or at least his father, who was very detached. And at the time, according to at least Lionel, his mother had some health issues and mental issues as well during that time, which made some complexities happen there. So even if Lionel's telling the truth, this kind of just leads me to believe that then that means that Jeffrey had been needing to hide things from what should have been a support in his life for a long, long, long time before that. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been so effective at it. But let's continue watching the rest of this.
Well, my wife, Sherry, and I visit him.
Your second wife?
Yes. Routinely. We talk to him every week on the phone. We're very, very close. We've gotten very close.
Do you still love your son?
Since his arrest, much more close.
Do you still love your son?
I still love my son. I'll always stick by him. I always have.
Mm-hmm.
And I still love him very, very much.
Do you see him as sick?
I think he has a very deep psychosis. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
Mm-hmm.
I think he has something that he does not understand. And I would really love, if he were amenable and it would not destroy him mentally, I would like to see him study. That was one of the reasons I wrote the book.
Because you'd like to
provide funds for research, for treatment of him, to donate to victims groups, to create new groups, and so forth and so on. Sherry and I discussed this extensively.
To see him studied.
Studied and helped.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
You think he can be helped?
I think if we can get back to the time where this hypothetical mixing of his sexuality with his frustrations and anger,
now,
maybe we can get to it.
Do you see anything that you or your wife at the time could have done to prevent this?
Well, there was a lot going on. There was a lot of mental, my former wife had a lot of mental and physical problems. And we were so occupied with those problems that it was difficult to concentrate on anything else.
Or to see that your child was becoming increasingly lost.
Increasingly shy, that's all that we saw. I mean, there was, I would encourage any parent, though, who has problems, and there are millions of people who have a divorce, who have marital problems, draw out information in all kinds of ways, with your minister, with your rabbi, with
because now you can see where the trouble was breeding itself.
The psychologist that I have seen to help me through this said he didn't even know if he could ever draw out anything, to elicit anything, to show these bizarre thoughts that were developing Jeff's mind. But it's worth a trial. It's worth a checkup for any parents. Take their kids. If they're extremely shy, it doesn't mean that they have to go to a psychologist, but go for a checkup if they're not talking to anyone at all about their fears and anger. So
something's going on.
Do something. Yeah.
Okay, so that's where that ends. So some things that happened there at the very end as well that I did want to make note of. Obviously, the first thing that popped into Lionel's head when he was talking about his son and things that he wished would happen is that this son would be studied. And then it was like, oh, good Lord, that's also my child. I wish he would be helped too. And it's like, oh, well, thank you, Lionel. I appreciate that. Very loving of you. Along with that, then he also is bringing in that health difficulty with the mother in that situation. So he himself, even there, admits not able to be present. Can't be. And he said in his book that he's emotionally not present. So 2 different areas he's now said that he really just couldn't be present to catch any of these things. And then in other interviews, he said that he was very emotionally attached and very close to his son. So there's some contradictory things in there as well. And then finally, something that was not seen in this interview, but is in some other ones. And if you would like me to go and watch some of the other videos from Lionel to help build some more of this backstory of Jeffrey, then I will. But in some other interviews, he is very overtly homophobic. And even in this, his solution to getting information from the child, instead of it being, hey, let's make myself a little bit of a safe place for this child to talk to me about stuff, his solution is, well, why don't you just get the rabbis involved and the priests and everybody else involved so that if there is something, then at least the person feels ganged up on. So that's going to be pretty welcoming for them as well. So I would say that a better admonishment, not to just elicit stuff from your kid if you're worried about it, try to make yourself a space to where you're going to be more available for them. And then, if you have been available and have taken the time to do that, and you're still having trouble, then figure out something with some professional help, something along those lines. This was an eye-opening thing for me to be able to see how Lionel didn't necessarily create Jeffrey, but he most certainly didn't hinder Jeffrey going down the path that Jeffrey went down, if only from just the mistake of being purely absent and rather analytical towards his son. Okay, so with the release of the recent Netflix series on Dahmer, there have been an uptick in requests centered around his life, both himself and the people that are involved in his life. Today, we're going to be looking at his parents specifically to see what sort of indicators there may have been as to what led to Jeffrey Dahmer in and of himself. This is my third video in the Dahmer series, so to speak. If you would like to watch the other two, they are listed in the description of this video. One of them is centered around Jeffrey Dahmer himself, then one around Lionel and that relationship there. And now we're having a comparison of two recollections of how the pregnancy of Jeffrey Dahmer really played out. And so they're very different recollections of it, and I find that very fascinating, especially because of the implications thereof. So we'll take a look at that. And if there are more questions that you have or more interviews that you would like me to look at, especially there's one where Lionel and Jeffrey both are sitting down together. If you want me to take a look at that sort of interview, just let me know in the description of this video. However, for now, let's go ahead and just start watching this one. It's going to start off with Lionel and how he recollects the birth and how he recollects the entire pregnancy, and then it'll switch over and we'll watch Joyce's side as well. Let's go ahead and do that.
In his endless second-guessing about the upbringing of his child, there is one last agonizing possibility that haunts Lionel Dahmer. That the drugs he says were prescribed for his wife when she was pregnant with Jeffrey might have harmed him. Lionel remembers a very difficult pregnancy.
Her jaw would go sideways and lock, and her eyes would bulge. And I know it sort of sounds like epilepsy. It does sound like a seizure of some kind. Right. But it was not diagnosed as that. The doctor did not say that that's what it was. He did not know what it was.
Okay, so this is kind of the two different narratives that we're going to be working with here. Is this side from Lionel saying that perhaps the medications that the mother was on caused some of these difficulties, and as he's going through and recollecting all of these things, there's not too much that's varying from his baseline. He hasn't had any spikes in his tone or pitch or anything along those lines on the auditory side, and then along with that, we haven't seen anything stray from his casual baseline as well as we've seen him talking. I will note, however, that there are some interesting verbal patterns that he's using here, to where he's specifically saying that he's found this solution, more or less. He's like, this, I know that this sounds like epilepsy, which he describes a scenario and then immediately offers a solution of what it possibly could be. And then he then says that the doctor didn't describe it as that. He'd said that it was not that. And it's very specific with his wording. It sounds interesting that he's really, really trying to hang it on this specific area, and very, very intensely so. And so that I do find interesting. I'm really curious as to why he's really hammering home that the doctor didn't diagnose it specifically as epilepsy. I'm just curious. Just a verbal red flag, but we're going to continue watching.
He did not know what it was. A doctor would usually have to intervene, giving Joyce injections of barbiturates and morphine, which would finally relax her.
While current medical literature says barbiturates taken during pregnancy can cause fetal damage, at Jeffrey's trial, experts said it was impossible to link his criminal behavior to the prescription drugs his mother may have taken during her pregnancy.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and pause that. So that's kind of what Lionel's side of this is that, oh, this could be the possibility of it. Now, what I have difficulty with is that there are some areas where it seems as though it is rather gray, that he doesn't know what was really going on, and it is going to turn soon into a he said, she said sort of situation. But the fact that it was also discovered that there's just not really a possibility of the medicines causing that sort of issue, then that should have been a good enough indication for that specific avenue to be dropped. And if it hadn't been dropped yet, if it had been disproven and still had not been dropped, then that means that there's something else that's behind there that's really keeping it in there for Lionel. Perhaps there's some form of disagreement within the marriage or something along those lines, to where even though he's being told that it's not an actual possibility, he's still holding on to it with such force and passion. So I do find that interesting. A little bit of a red flag on that side of things. Let's continue watching and we'll see kind of how Joyce's goes.
Pregnancy. And tests showed no brain or genetic abnormalities. When we asked Joyce about her pregnancy, she disputed much of what Lionel said had happened and told us she doesn't know why he continues to raise questions about it, unless it's to blame her.
There were no seizures. I can't imagine where that comes from. It isn't true. I don't...
You don't recall anything like that?
No.
Seizures or seizure-like episodes?
Absolutely not.
Is it?
Okay, so now I'm going to make some notes about what I'm seeing non-verbally from Joyce. It looks like she has had some freezing of her facial muscles here and there, so that's going to make it a little bit more difficult to see some of the micro-expressions that might creep in, especially in and around the eyes and the cheeks and nose area. So like in this area here where there can be some action being seen for various emotional tells, that's going to be fairly absent. That'll make it a little bit muddier to work with, to be sure. So then along with that, we're hearing now that she has fully denied every form of physical difficulty in realms of seizures, and that does distinctly go against what Lionel had said earlier. And with Lionel's, he does bring up the aspects of, well, the medical side of things, but even in that, there was some suspicious verbal behavior around that medical side of things. And now Joyce is saying that that absolutely did not happen. So we're really going to have to try to hone in here to see if there are any contradictions in various areas, to see which aspect might be more authentic. And chances are there will probably be some aspects of both that are authentic, because that's usually where the truth ends up lying, is somewhere in the in-between. But let's just see how this plays out real quick first.
Is it possible you just don't remember them, Joyce?
No, it's not possible. I don't remember them. It was my first pregnancy. I remember everything about my first pregnancy.
Were you prescribed medications, including morphine, barbiturates?
I don't know what medications were prescribed, and
Okay, so this is where it does get a little bit interesting, because Joyce brings up a very good point. First pregnancy is a very important, monumental time in a person's life, pretty heavy in a person's memory, would stick there pretty well. So with them being like, no, I would remember these things, that is fairly true. That you would expect that and feel that to be true. Along with that, we're seeing a little bit of aggression come in with that increase in pitch and tone and force behind their words, as well as they're defending this aspect fairly steadily. And then right after that, though, once it's brought up with the medication side of things, okay, but then you were on these sorts of medications, she does also immediately say, well, I don't know what those were. So she in kind of the same flow of phrasing here, went from I remember everything throughout the pregnancy to I don't remember what medications were during the pregnancy. They were just given and I was prescribed and I took. It is still a possibility for sure. Like there is that possibility that maybe she just really didn't care what medicines she was taking or keep track of them and just trusted the doctor to give and take whatever. So that is that possibility, but it does kind of seem interesting that within one sentence, one phrase, one thought pattern there, it does have a switch of I remember everything to no, I don't remember the medications. That is at least a red flag. So now we have a couple red flags for both sides. Let's continue watching.
And I had a doctor, a physician. I took the medicine that was prescribed for me, and for the most part, I was healthy. There was nothing that was out of the ordinary as far as my pregnancy was concerned.
Okay, so now we're gonna go ahead and pause. Sounds like there's gonna be a qualifier added here, but she said, and I was healthy for the most part, and rushes by it right on to the next part. So that is a red flag to me, that verbal rushing straight on through, and I was healthy through the next part, and then boom, right on to the next subject. That does raise a little bit of a red flag. That does indicate that perhaps just that urgency to rush through that specific phrase might mean that there's something that needs to be asked there or dwelt on there to find out that perhaps there were more health complications than what she's admitting here. And she's saying that nothing was wrong with her pregnancy except for, and let's hear what the except for is real quick.
In the end, she, like Lionel, has no answers, only questions.
Okay, so that actually didn't answer it at all. That just faded out. So I'm wondering what that except for part that was just faded out in this specific interview segment that I was able to find. So there does seem to be some difficulties in the pregnancy. Lionel insists that there were difficulties. Joyce is saying that the pregnancy was overall normal, but that maybe there were some other health things and things along with that on the back end side of things. This is very curious. Let's continue watching.
Jeff was raised with all the love and care and concern that any child could be raised with. And what happened to him? I don't know. I wish I knew. I'd give anything to know. I asked the universe, why would this be allowed to happen? I don't have an answer for that.
You don't have any answers, do you?
No. No, I don't.
Okay. So that's the end of that video. So in that, I also find it interesting that at the very end, Joyce also insists that Jeffrey was raised with all of this kind, care, compassion, so on and so forth. And we know that that's simply not the case, even from what we've heard from what Lionel depicts, and then also just the fact that with the parents' dynamics themselves, that there are certain things that are always sacrificed in that specific level of conflict in a family. And all of the care and happiness is difficult to give during that level of conflict. From what I'm seeing here, even just looking at it in general, it looks as if both parents are very, very defensive in general of themselves and willing to lash out at the other to more or less maintain some sense of self in this. As far as the effect that this had on Jeffrey Dahmer. So even just in the back and forth that we've seen here between Lionel and Joyce, between the two aspects of specifically the physical health and perhaps mental health in there as well, that they, even after splitting, have had substantial amounts of disagreements and headbutting in that. And to have that sort of turbulence be a source of possible conflict in a home can make it to where it does isolate said child, which we all do know that Dahmer was very isolated in his way of thinking, and even just with how he felt he could express himself. And there are a whole pile of things that go into that. And certainly in this, I don't believe that the Dahmer parents are the ones that are solely at fault for turning Jeffrey into what he did. But I will say that some of the things that they did during Jeffrey's life did not aid him in becoming a healthier version of him, but more so in this secluded, isolated, and twisted version that he ended up developing. Looking at these sorts of instances in these cases, especially when you're able to hear from both parents and understand how they both feel in regards to what has occurred and what their child became when they grew up, it definitely adds complexity to the situation, because chances are, regardless of how messy Joyce and Lionel were, they did not intend on fathering a son who would do what Jeffrey did. That's probably inarguable, I would say. But in that, it still feels as if they are trying to almost shrug their responsibility onto the other rather than shouldering it on their own. Okay, so as I said, this is not the first video that I have done on Jeffrey Dahmer. I have done a series on both him and his parents and talking about some of the dynamics and interdynamics between them. But today's video is an interview, a not very well covered interview. I've only found it on a few places throughout the internet, and I have not done an analysis of it here on the channel. But it's of him and his dad sitting down together for an interview. It lends towards some interesting interdynamics between the two of them, and it still opens up a little bit of an understanding to the function behind the actions of Jeffrey Dahmer. I think that's all of the backstory that I'll give for this one. If you want more of that, go and check out the other videos first. That being said, let's go ahead and jump right into at least the first part of this very lengthy interview. I've broken it up. If you like it, we'll do more. Let's begin.
Hi, Jeff. Sherry, how are you? Good to see you. It's good to see you. Hi, Jeff. Yes, I'm voice. I'm Mr. Phil. How are you? Just spending the last few days with your folks. Great. Talking about a lot of different things. Hey, you're lucky it came up on a day when there's much snow. It was snowing like crazy all weekend. I know.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and pause here. Fascinating nonverbal communication from Jeffrey to begin with. He walks in and he's very confident. You don't see him shuffling in. He's got a decently relaxed stride. He goes in for a confident handshake. And then the audio falls apart a little bit because this is a really old interview, obviously. But he also knows the people by their first names, letting us know that he had some preparation as to who he was going to be talking to. And he immediately falls into this small talk banter, which lets us know that even with his functionality day to day, he understood social norms and how to fall in place with those social norms, even comfortably so, even in an area that this is obviously a unique situation, to be sitting down with your dad, talking to a person who's interested in asking you about why you're a cannibal. It's a fascinating dynamic that he's working with, but even still, he has very overtly controlled social behavior. And I think that characterizes Jeffrey Dahmer throughout the entirety of his story. He has this overt social control. We'll see some various fascinating elements of his psyche come out as he's talking about them. And it's just interesting. Let's continue.
How are things going here for you? Slow and steady. Nothing out of the ordinary, really. You've read the...
Slow and steady. He has a fall off in pitch. Not a lot of force behind that. To me, that indicates a level of negative sentiment or emotion around that statement. Slow and steady. Then he does a very overt mouth shrug and lip compression in there, which is, I don't know. When you see a mouth shrug in there, it's the same as seeing a normal shrug or a partial shrug. It's that I don't know sentiment. And so we see that. And then he says nothing out of the ordinary, really. To me, basing off of the fall off of pitch and then that little mouth shrug in there, I'm not buying that statement, that not too much out of the ordinary. I feel like perhaps things have been a little bit less pleasant for him, but maybe that's what he's considering out of the ordinary, so it still would line up. Regardless, non-verbally speaking, that cluster there pushes me a little bit away from that statement of, slow and steady, nothing out of the ordinary. Fascinating. Let's continue.
You've read the book? Yes, I read the book. My dad sent it to me about last week, and spent all night reading it. Was up all night reading it.
A lot of ums and uhs where he didn't have that before. I read the book, this repetition. He's buying time, having verbal difficulty. You see even a lopsided shrug there towards the very end where he was saying, I stayed up all night reading it. That little lopsided shrug. To me, that indicates that he had a decent amount of agitation around that. The lopsided shrug indicates either insecurity or insincerity. Maybe he didn't read the entire book. Maybe he was feeling insecure about what the book was stating, but he's saying that he read the book, had verbal difficulty with it, had some nonverbal indicators of insecurity or insincerity. It's fascinating nonverbally. Let's continue.
It was quite a surprise to me, some parts of it. Very interesting. In what sense? Just some of the things that were revealed caught me off guard, and just some very big surprises in it for me.
What was it that you off guard?
Some of his insights into what he thought of me as I was growing up.
Okay, so with that does explain contextually, as he's saying, there were some surprises that he interacted with and came into contact with as he was reading the book. It's in regards to what his dad said while writing the book. So with that, it would make sense, even with that as the emotional starting point for this, that there wouldn't be a lot of camaraderie interaction between him and his dad. I would expect to see that non-verbally through various things, perhaps through the positioning, through verbal intonation, things like that. You might see that separation between Jeff and his dad. We'll see how that plays out.
All set? Everybody ready? Okay, let's all take a deep breath. Your dad comes here to visit about once a month, but I get the impression that the two of you don't talk a lot about everything that happened, about the crimes in particular.
No, we don't discuss that because it's been gone over so thoroughly in the papers and the media that there's just really no point in going into any in-depth talks about it. We talk about our family, home, how things used to be, what prison life is like here now, and try to keep things as light and upbeat as possible.
Is it hard?
All right, so pausing here. Jeffrey's nonverbal communication is indicating a little bit of desire to separate himself from his dad. If you see his dad sitting very relaxed in the chair, takes a swig of water at the beginning, this is likely due to agitation and nerves. It's a fairly broadcasted interview. There's going to be some nerves. Jeffrey doesn't have any indicators like that, which is one of those insider looks into his mind. He doesn't seem to be rattled by many things. Jeffrey doesn't, which it makes sense contextually with even the kind of person that he is. Now, non-verbally speaking, you see him in his chair. He's leaning ever so slightly away from his dad, whereas his dad's sitting center of gravity, very centered in the chair. Jeffrey is leaning a little bit away. So that, to me, indicates perhaps a level of that separation that we were talking about earlier, with the emotional side of the interview being set by Jeffrey being taken aback by some of the things that his dad said in this book that he wrote. And we're seeing that non-verbally throughout that. And then we're hearing him talk about the topics that they talk about during their visits, which apparently his dad visited every single week. So it's fascinating to see that his dad visited weekly, but there's still this level of separation. And I feel like that probably characterized their relationship up until Jeffrey's death, as there would be an obvious level of separation between the two. Speaking on his father's nonverbal communication, you could see very frequent blinking, which that frequent blinking indicates a level of psychological processing. People will blink at an average rate, and then if you see anything freeze from that or spike from that, that indicates a level of agitation with various emotional veins that stray from that. So we're seeing that increase in blinking, which means an increase of thought. It is fascinating. Let's continue on through this.
Is it hard for you to go back and talk about those things?
No.
Just from that response, how long the response is it difficult for you to go back and talk about those things, in case you didn't catch that? Jeffrey's response is a long period of thinking, which lets us know that he's weighing his words fairly heavily. But then when he closes his mouth, he has a little slight indicator of possible contempt, as one side of the mouth is activated a little bit more than the other side. And to me, that indicates that perhaps there's not actually a level of consternation about going back and talking about these things. He's not troubled by these things. But let's hear what he says verbally instead of what his nonverbals are indicating.
No, not the good things. In fact, it gives me a sense of comfort to talk about the few good times there were in the past.
You say the few good times. Do you think of your childhood as having been profoundly unhappy?
No, not profoundly. My childhood wasn't filled with any great tragedies or anything. There were good times and there were bad times.
All right, so at the beginning there, after he answers the initial question, you see a number of self-soothing gestures. He's talked about how it's not that difficult for him to go back and talk about the okay things, and that makes sense with the possible contempt that we saw, the moral and intellectual superiority that he felt earlier. His response was no to the question, and it's not bad to talk about the good things. And then he has a number of agitation tells with the lip licks and various movements of the mouth there, indicating self-soothing and manipulators centered around that agitation. And then he starts going off into the answering the question of whether or not his childhood was really that difficult. And he says no. And from what I can see, again, the resolution's it's awful. So from what I can see, he has synchronized nonverbal communication with what he's saying there. I don't actually believe that he thought that his childhood was that awful. As he's saying positives, he nods. As he's saying negatives, he shakes his head. He has an area where he's talking about, I don't know, I don't feel like there were too many bad things, and he has a mouth shrug in there. All of these are synchronized with what he's stating. So from what I understand, Jeffrey didn't feel like his entire situation that he became at the end of things was due exclusively to his childhood, which some people have pushed that this was largely a nurture thing, that he started off a certain way and because of his bad childhood he became this certain thing. I don't believe that he feels that way himself, that he probably feels that there was some of the nature involved as well and not just exclusively nurture. Regardless, let's continue.
Times. I think it was fairly normal. Jeff, do you remember your
That I don't actually necessarily buy. One, because the qualifier fairly. He says, I think it was fairly normal. Also, a little bit of drop in force behind his words as he's saying that, indicating perhaps a lack of sincerity with that, or a lack of confidence would be a way of looking at it. He's saying fairly with less projection, so perhaps he's not feeling like that was the case. And then you see a little bit of agitation creep into the lower half of his body as his legs shift around a little bit. To me, I feel like perhaps he did feel like he had an abnormal childhood, but as per earlier, that it wasn't an all bad situation, or that the childhood that he had wasn't the sole reason for how he ended up. Fascinating non-verbally what we're seeing. Let's continue.
Remember your earliest experience and earliest interest, fascination with the inside of animals? Where that came from?
Yeah.
Okay, earliest, and we start to see a pretty overt postural change here. This is letting us know non-verbally. It's a non-verbal indicator towards a role switch within Jeffrey's mind, his psychology. He's going to switch from listening and to speaking and putting himself back into a historical point in his own lifetime. Anytime that a person has to switch roles, be it in a conversation, be it energetically, anything like that, you'll see that postural change. It's a very reliable tell to see when a person's ready to switch up things, even if they don't speak. If you see a person-to-person interaction kind of thing, and you see somebody do a big postural change in there, that's not indicated by any other physical discomfort or anything along those lines, then you can fairly reasonably rely on the fact that they're preparing for a role change in that interaction. So we see that. Now he's going to start talking about his stuff.
In ninth grade, in biology class, we had the usual dissection of fetal pigs. I took the remains of that home and kept the skeleton of it. And I just started branching out, dogs, cats. I suppose it could have turned into a normal hobby like taxidermy, but it didn't. It veered off into this.
All right, so throughout that, you see the no shake that's consistently in there. It's just big enough to be possibly macro. Again, for those of you who do not know, the larger the movement, the more likely and easily controlled it is. So if you see somebody doing very overt motions with their body, they can more easily control those things. If you start to see super, super small, minute movements, those ones are more difficult to control consciously, especially in areas like interviews or high-pressure situations. Your psyche is already so focused on trying to present in a specific way for those that the smaller things often go by the wayside. So we see that it seems to be walking the fence of micro to macro. If it's a macro, then it would be related to the you wouldn't believe, which makes sense absolutely contextually, as he's saying, yeah, I would do this and this and this, and each of them are kind of interesting characteristics about a child. Not a lot of people go and take the bodies from their dissection class in biology and take it home and wait till you have the skeleton and things like that. That's not as common. And so during that, you see him shaking his head as perhaps you wouldn't believe. The other possibility with that, if it was more of a micro, that could be an indicator of a desynchronization point, as he's saying he did a thing but was leaking that he didn't do a thing. Now, since there is concrete physical evidence and eyewitnesses to the alternate side of things, where he's saying that he did do these things and you might not believe it, that's going to be the avenue that we're pushed down, because it makes sense contextually with what we're already given outside of that as well. So we're seeing that no shake in there as he's saying that it might be unbelievable, which then the reason that this is important is because it lets us know that Jeffrey, even at this point here, he understood that his mindset, his functioning of things was not the norm. It's not how most people function, and he never strayed away from that. He always accepted that how he functioned was different from the people around him, and he never even tried to shy away from it. He never tried to divert attention. He never tried to say, oh, I was pretty much a normal guy and it was all everybody else's fault, anything along those lines. He always maintained responsibility and an acknowledgement that how he functioned and processed through things psychologically was not the norm for the people around him. Let's continue.
Why, I don't know. All I know is that I wanted to see what the insides of these animals looked like.
Was there some pleasure in the cutting open of the animal?
Yes, there was. No sexual pleasure, but just it's hard to describe.
Sense of power, sense of control?
I suppose that's a good way of putting it, yeah.
All right, non-verbally speaking, he responds to that question of, was there a sense of pleasure in doing these actions? Very quick. He didn't have to think about it. It wasn't something that he had to plan out. He wasn't weighing his responses. He does in many other questions. You can tell that Jeffrey weighs his responses before he says them in many instances. In this one, it was just a very quick yes. Yes, it was. There was a sense of pleasure about this. Absolutely. Synchronized nonverbal communication with this. And then when asked to clarify, was it perhaps a sense of power? Again, we see the synchronized nonverbal communication throughout that, which that did characterize Jeffrey largely, was this sense of he wanted to control things. He wanted to have this sense of power, which there are a number of psychological things that can lend towards that, both in the nurture and nature side of things. In a family dynamic, if a child is left feeling very powerless or voiceless, oftentimes in their adult life, they will seek out avenues to exude power and to feel power that they perhaps didn't feel as a child. Now, this can be done in healthy ways, and it can be done in very unhealthy ways as well, which is where obviously Jeffrey lies, is in the unhealthy way of dealing with this feeling of lack of power. But then that also doesn't exclude the possibility of just an innate need for power within him. Perhaps for him, he just functions psychologically in a way that seeks after power. This is not unheard of. Let's continue.
I can sort of see a fascination for, wanting to see or for looking at the insides, say for the first time.
Now, non-verbally speaking, as he's talking here, we're seeing his dad's head move around a lot. So it's not a yes and it's not a no. And to me, the circular motion indicates a waffling in between the two. So it indicates to me a level of insecurity in what's being said. Along with that, verbally, it's synchronized with saying, I can sort of see how ... So we're seeing that from him, but due to the overt nature of his nonverbal communication, indicating this lack of security or sincerity, not really feeling what he's saying here, that pushes me to believe that the following statement from his dad is going to be challenging to what he just stated. He said that he could see it. I'm betting there's going to be a but ... side of things, just speaking non-verbally from what we've seen here. Let's see.
After you did it one time, what more is to be gained by looking at another dog's inside, the second or third?
I don't know. That's it. I came to compulsion, and it switched from animals to humans.
So with that, that's a pretty small no shake that Jeff has while he's saying, I don't know, and that's synchronized. So with that, unfortunately, I'm pushed to believe that he might actually not fully understand why, at least from his current state of psychology. Now, there's the possibility, and it's not unheard of, for people to be able to even kind of shoehorn themselves into corners where they genuinely believe things that at one point they did know, but now either because it's not something that they can really hold comfortably, or it's something that's not acceptable, or something that they dislike about themselves, that they end up pushing themselves into this state of willingly being ignorant of their own reasonings behind things. But non-verbally speaking, we're seeing that, and then we see a little shrug in there as he's saying, I don't know as well. So that little cluster of I don't know with a shrug in there, that indicates sincerity to me. I don't actually believe that Jeffrey knew why he did what he did. It's just something that he did do, which that brings in so many complexities to things, because what he did was arguably disgusting, heinous, and absolutely wrong, and on so many levels evil. I don't think anybody can deny those, and he himself didn't deny those, but he didn't ever admit to knowing why he did those. It's a fascinating battle that seems to exist within a number of these people who have done very awful things to other humans. It's fascinating. I feel like it's just an area of psychology that we we as a species don't fully understand how a person can be born into the world and be primed for everything in a normal life, but instead veer off on this very dark, twisted way. There are diagnoses that help clarify things. There are theories that help clarify things. But when it really boils down to it, we're still left wondering because we don't fully grasp our own minds. And the saying goes, if our brains were so simple that we could fully grasp them, we ourselves would be too simple to do so. Until we have some form of scientific revelation and leap forward, I don't know that we'll be able to genuinely understand why a person does these things, but we can rather understand why they perceive the world the way they do and what leads them to do these things as from their perspective. It's an interesting thing. Regardless, let's continue.
I still don't understand it. I don't know why.
What would you do with the dead animals, Jeff? You would pick the carcass.
I still don't understand. It's still micro nose shakes, a little shrug in there, all still indicating that. And then when you see another postural change, as he's wrapped up that statement, he switches around. His posture changes. It's going from the answering of a question, that specific question, to receiving another question. Role change, posture change. Makes sense. It's a repeatable pattern. Again, look for it in your own life. It'll pop up. You'll see it. It becomes very hard to miss. Let's continue.
The carcasses up from the road and take them back into the woods.
Take them back in the woods, skin them sometimes, slit them all the way open, look at the organs, feel them. There was a sort of general excitement for me. I don't know why. It was exciting to see.
I don't know why, and then you hear a shallow, shaky breath come in there. It's an indicator of agitation. Whether or not it's a negative or positive agitation is difficult to be able to say. It feels like contextually, perhaps this would be a mixture of both. It could be that possibility of like, it's a negative agitation because, yeah, it's an arguably unique characteristic to want to take animals and go into the forest and skin them and touch their insides and get all feely in there. That's interesting. But with that, he's saying verbally that he was excited by that. And so that shaky breath, that shallow shaky breath, that agitation could also be in the vein of excitement, which synchronizes with what he's saying verbally. So we're hearing that, we're understanding that even with these people that psychologically function vastly different, there's something different about the psychological processing of Jeffrey Dahmer as opposed to the everyday person. Even with that, the nonverbal communication that they show and display can oftentimes still be indicative of the psychological processing behind it. It's still very fascinating. It's important to make note of, even just for research and data purposes. Let's continue.
One of your dad's biggest questions is when you began to slip away, when you crossed over into this world of obsession.
Talking about this, you see the dad nod. Yes, these are things I said. And you see Jeffrey kind of move around. Another reposturing. This could be being uncomfortable in that situation or with what's being said. Perhaps he didn't want to disappoint his dad, and that's still something that's psychologically plaguing him, despite where things have already ended up for him as an adult. Regardless, we're seeing that nonverbal dynamic between the two. Let's continue.
Dark fantasy from which you just couldn't return. Can you pinpoint that? Is there a sense for when that really began to happen with you, Jeff?
I think it was around age 14 or 15. Started having obsessive thoughts of violence intermingled with sex. And it just got worse and worse. I didn't know how to tell anyone about it, so I didn't. I just kept it all inside.
All right, so pausing here to add some context to Jeffrey's life. Jeffrey obviously had a proclivity towards other men, which was not a thing that was acceptable at the time. So he felt very isolated with his own sexuality, felt like he could not approach it with his parents, could not approach it with his teachers. Already there was that aspect of things. Along with that, he had this other darker interest and fascination with the internal functionings of various living beings. At the time, it was only animals. But as is nature's wont, a certain level is never enough. You always have to go to the next level. And as you get used to a certain threshold, you have to seek the next level of threshold to be able to achieve the same result. So he has that, and then he has his already very stifled sexual exploration and interest. So then, for a young, growing mind, he married the two together, which to me, it seems to be the very small origins of what he ended up being, was these two avenues that he felt unable to express to anybody for fear of ostracization or for fear of perhaps even punishment, something along those lines. He kept those locked away inside, but they continued to grow, and he continued to hit the thresholds that he hit until eventually, even by just natural order of things, he had to reach the next step, which was taking it from this fantasy realm to the realm beyond. Now, there are ways to release this pent-up energy that he was feeling that are healthier, and there are ways to talk to people and find communities and things that allow you to express yourself in specific ways that maybe others won't understand, but you could find the community who does, who's supportive, and keeps you on a moral pathway while doing so rather than an amoral one. So there is that possibility, but for him specifically, it didn't seem as though he had those outlets available to him. He ended up internalizing it, and it festered, and it started to come out in ways that he specifically and only exclusively could control. Again, centered around this mindset of control. And from his childhood growing up, if you have watched the other videos, you know that he had a very controlled childhood. It's an unfortunate situation. Let's continue.
Do you have any sense for where that was coming from?
No. No, I've talked with a few psychologists about it. They have their theories, but they don't have any concrete answers either.
Do you have a theory?
No, not really. I don't know where it came from. I probably will never know. But I never dreamed that it would become a reality.
For him.
Fascinating. And again, with the disclaimer that Jeffrey Dahmer did monstrous, evil, horrific things and ruined so many people's lives and the families around them and acquaintances, everything. It's unfortunate to still hear a person trying to work through life with these various characteristics and psychological processings that they themselves don't fully understand why it is the way they function. The reason that I believe he's being authentic is due to the nonverbal communication that is synchronized with his answers. There is the possibility that he's controlling it. Again, these size of movements are controllable. So he is shaking his head like that, and it is fairly macro, but it is synchronized with what he's saying, and it stays synchronized contextually with what he stuck to throughout all of his interviews, is that he accepted responsibility but did not know fully as to why. At some point, Jeffrey, a young child, felt so isolated that he felt he could not express some of these interests in a healthy, moral way. That's not okay. And so because of that, he festers and becomes the monster that he did, and that's even less okay. And the entire situation is not okay. It's not okay. And non-verbally speaking, it just adds weight to that. Let's continue.
What was it, Jeff, that took you over the edge, do you think, and made you take this from the world of fantasy into reality?
From 15 on, I had this reoccurring fantasy of meeting a hitchhiker on the road, and of taking him hostage and doing what I wanted with him. About 3 years later, I was 18 years old, driving home. I saw this hitchhiker about a mile from my house. I thought to myself, should I stop and pick him up, or should I just keep on going? I wish I just kept on going, but I didn't. I turned around, picked him up, and
we're hearing agitation start to flood into his verbal patterns as there's deeper sighs and a lot of ums and uhs and hesitations. The agitation is very clear. Non-verbally speaking, we're starting to see some fidgeting around here with his fingers, as those are self-soothing gestures. And then even further down, we're seeing his legs start to have activation as well. He's feeling very uncomfortable with this situation, and it's showing in his nervous system through these self-soothing agitation gestures cropping up in various areas. He doesn't like talking about this situation, even though he's very willingly talking about it. We can rely more reasonably on his nonverbal communication for being less on board with speaking about it than he's verbally giving indicators for. Let's continue.
That's when the nightmare became a reality. It just seemed so bizarre to me that this obsession that I had been thinking about and wanting, just all the parts are there, and they make it possible to make it happen.
What happened after you took him to the house?
The house was empty. My mother was up in Chippewa Falls with her family, and my dad was living in a rented motel about 5 miles away due to the divorce. And I pretty much had the place to myself. I was drinking a lot during that time, and just
I find that fascinating. While he's talking about, while he's talking about where the parents were located, I was watching to see his dad's nonverbal communication to see if there was anything that was being revealed to his dad during that time. From what I was seeing nonverbally, there were no responses to what he was stating, letting me know that his dad knew everything that has already been talked about here, which makes sense even contextually with what they said earlier on. All of this has been covered in so many interviews and so many media outlets that by this point that there was no point in continuing to talk about it. And then at the very end, he's saying that he had the house pretty much all to himself, and he has a little tiny no shake in that. To me, that pushes away from him having the house to himself. And even verbally speaking, he says that he pretty much had it to himself. The qualifiers of pretty much, to me, that pushes me to ask why those qualifiers and why that nonverbal communication? Who else was there? Was there somebody else there? And if not, why offer those qualifiers? Logically speaking, that to me indicates that there must have been somebody else there at times. I'm not sure. Regardless, non-verbally speaking, he's indicating that he did not have the house fully to himself the entire time. It's a very fascinating thing. I don't have an outlet or an answer as to why he does display that there. I don't know that we'll ever know if perhaps another person visited the house, if there were somebody else involved with this entire situation, or if this was just nonverbal communication that was happening without a psychological reasoning behind it. Not positive. Regardless, let's continue on the rest of the interview.
And just, I don't know, looking for something some way to find some fulfillment, some pleasure. And I acted on my fantasies, and that's where everything went wrong.
This was the summer of 1978 when you took your first victim.
Right. Once it happened the first time, it just seemed like it had control of my life from there on in.
Okay, so that's where this portion of the interview ends. Again, we're left with this sentiment that Jeffrey himself felt like he was out of control for much of it, that the compulsion that he had to do XYZ was so overwhelming that he himself did not have the willpower to push against it, which is not unheard of in psychology in general. The very concept of addiction shows that many people simply do not have the willpower to be able to break cycles that they find themselves in, especially when those cycles in some way, even if it's to their ultimate detriment, give them a level of fulfillment. What we're left then wondering as audiences, as psychologists and scientists, is asking the question, is this form of action, these very vile, evil, horrible things that Jeffrey did, were they an addiction to him? Did he have an actual psychological choice? Or was this something that was a conscious decision that he made each and every time? All that we're left doing is asking these questions of why do some people find these evil, heinous things irresistible, when so many of the rest of the population are completely turned away from it. Even at the end of this little blip here, I'm still asking the same things because non-verbally speaking, he showed no indicators to push me away from what he was saying. To me, it feels like instances like this feel like we have a missing puzzle piece. And I don't know what that puzzle piece is. And unfortunately, I don't know that anybody alive knows what that puzzle piece is and what clicks into place and suddenly makes the entire thing clear and makes the entire thing something that's addressable. So that's the analysis of this little blip here. All of this is just adding more data to the pool of what we have in regards to serial killers and various people who do arguably evil things. So let me know in the comments of this video if there's somebody else that you would like me to do an analysis on. If you would like me to continue down this interview itself, there are more questions that are asked. It's a much longer interview. This is only about a third of the interview itself. So if you would like to see more of it, let me know. And if there are any other videos outside of that you would like to be able to see, again, the comments is a great place to be able to do that. I have both a Patreon and a membership if you would like to be able to support me a little bit extra beyond just viewing the channel videos and subscribing. I do appreciate it if you do that. There is no pressure to do that at all, but thank you if you do. I also have a link tree linked at the top of this description that will allow you to follow towards my socials and towards a landing page that has my credentials and reading list and backstory towards getting into this avenue of nonverbal communication as a career. So if you're interested in following a similar pathway, go ahead and follow that link in the description of this video. But without further ado, that's all that I've got for the day. My name is Logan, and you have been oh so awesome as you always are, and I will see you in the next video. Cheers, guys.